Imagine growing up and finding out your father helped murder millions of people. He wasn't just a soldier or an officer, he was one of the men who planned it all. What would you do with a name like that? Would you change it, hide it, or try to make things right? That's exactly what happened to the children of the Third Reich. While Hitler didn't have kids, many of the top Nazi leaders did. And after the war, their children were left with something heavy, not money or power, but a name tied to evil. They didn't ask for it. They didn't earn it. But they had to carry it. Some stayed silent. Some felt shame. And a few chose to speak out, no matter the cost. And this is their story. Monika Hertwig, the daughter of a monster. Monika Hertwig was just a little girl when her mother told her that her father had died in the war. She said he was a hero, a soldier who served his country, a good man. For most of her childhood, Monika believed that. She imagined a brave, kind father who died with honor. But as she got older, small cracks began to appear in the story. Whispers, silence, questions that her mother never fully answered. Then one day, everything changed. Monika watched a film that shocked the world, Schindler's List. On the screen was a man in a Nazi uniform, standing on a balcony with a rifle, casually picking off prisoners for sport. That man's name was Amon Goeth, and he was her father. She was frozen, not just because of what he did, but because of what it meant for her. Amon Goeth was the commandant of the Plaszow concentration camp near Krakow. He was known for his cruelty. Survivors said he shot people for no reason, that he let his dogs tear prisoners apart, that he treated human life like trash. He was one of the most sadistic figures of the Holocaust. Monika couldn't believe it. Was this really the man whose blood ran in her veins? She needed answers. So she started digging. She traveled to Poland, to the camp where her father ruled with terror. She walked the same ground where thousands were murdered. She read survivor accounts, saw photos, and visited museums. But one thing haunted her most. Her father didn't just kill strangers. He also had enslaved people working inside his own home. One of them was Helen Jonas. Helen was a young Jewish girl when Amon Goeth forced her to work as his housemaid. She lived in fear every second. If she dropped a glass or made a noise, she could be shot. She saw him beat people, kill people. She lived under the same roof as a monster and survived. Monika reached out to her. She wanted to meet. At first, Helen wasn't sure. Why should she talk to the daughter of the man who nearly destroyed her life? But something told her to say yes. They met on camera in a small, quiet room. Monika came with shaking hands. She brought a photo of her father. She didn't say much at first, just sat and listened. Helen spoke slowly, remembering what it was like to serve Amon Goeth. The fear, the blood, the screams. At one point, Monika looked up and asked a question that no child should ever have to ask. "Can you ever forgive me?" Helen paused. Then she said, "You didn't do anything. You are not your father." But the pain in the room was thick. Both women cried. They had nothing in common, except a man who had ruined both their lives in different ways. For Monika, this moment changed everything. She realized she couldn't undo what her father did. But she could face it, speak about it, refuse to stay silent. Still, the guilt never fully left her. "He's in me," she once said. "He's part of who I am, and I hate it." Monika Hertwig didn't choose her father, but she chose the truth. And that choice took courage. She spoke at schools, gave interviews, told the story that her mother had tried to hide. Not for fame, but because she believed the past doesn't stay buried unless you dig it up and face it head-on. Monika had met the victim. She cried with her, and she grieved. But another child of the Third Reich would take a different path. He wouldn't just ask for forgiveness. He would declare war on his father's memory. Niklas Frank, the son who fights his father. Niklas Frank didn't shed quiet tears. He raised his voice and never stopped shouting. He is the youngest son of Hans Frank, the Nazi governor-general of occupied Poland. His father wasn't just another high-ranking officer. He was in charge of an entire region during the Holocaust. Under his rule, millions of Jews were rounded up, deported, and murdered. Niklas was just 7 when the war ended. At first, he didn't understand what his father had done. But as he got older, the truth hit him very heavy. His father wasn't just part of the system. He helped run the machinery of death. So Niklas made a choice. He would not protect his family's name. He would destroy it. While many other Nazi heirs stayed quiet, Niklas did the opposite. He began writing angry public letters to his dead father, letters filled with rage and disgust. In one, he called him a slimy murderer. In another, he said he wished he could spit on his grave. He didn't stop there. He wrote a whole book called Der Vater, eine Abrechnung, the Father, a reckoning, where he broke apart the myth of his father being an honorable man. He called him out as a liar, a coward, and a criminal. He said his father had no soul. Niklas didn't care how people reacted. He went to schools, stood in front of young students, and told them exactly who his father was, and why that truth still matters. He showed photos of the ghettos. He told the stories of mass graves, and then he said, "That was my father's doing." He believed silence was dangerous, that forgetting was deadly, and that if nobody else in his family would speak up, he had to. But it wasn't easy. Niklas lived with deep shame, not just because of his name, but because he felt alone in his fight. His siblings, cousins, and other relatives wanted to move on. Some denied the crimes, others just wanted to forget, but Niklas refused. His honesty made him an outsider in his own family. "I lost my relatives because I was honest," he said in an interview, "but I couldn't live with lies." He often talked about the pain of being the only one willing to speak the truth, the weight of carrying a legacy he never asked for, the burden of turning against your own blood and doing it again and again. In one powerful moment, he stood in the courtroom in Nuremberg, where his father had once sat as a war criminal. Niklas looked around and imagined his father there, about to be sentenced to death. Instead of feeling sadness, he said he felt relief. "I'm glad he was hanged," he said. "It was justice." Some people were shocked by his words, but Niklas didn't care. He believed that only by ripping open old wounds could they ever begin to heal. And yet, behind all his fury, there was something else: heartbreak. Niklas often said he wished he had a father he could love, a father he could remember with pride, but he didn't. He had Hans Frank, and so he became his father's worst enemy, and maybe, in some strange way, his father's greatest punishment. His rage became his way of fighting for what's right. But not everyone could do that. Some heirs didn't fight their fathers. They defended them. They believed the lies their families told. They covered the truth with myths, denial, or silence. Even after the war, even after the evidence, they clung to the story that their fathers were just doing their jobs. One woman in particular refused to see her father as a killer. In fact, she still believes he was innocent, even though he was the commandant of Auschwitz. Gudrun Himmler, Daddy's little girl. While Niklas Frank stood in classrooms and called his father a murderer, Gudrun Himmler did the opposite. She stayed loyal, even to the end. Her father was Heinrich Himmler, one of the main architects of the Holocaust. As head of the SS and one of Hitler's closest allies, he was responsible for building and running the Nazi concentration and extermination camps. If Hitler was the face of the Third Reich, Himmler was its hands, cold, calculating, and covered in blood. But to Gudrun, he was just Papi. As a child, Gudrun adored him. She kept a scrapbook filled with photos of them together, laughing, walking in gardens, smiling for the camera. He wrote her loving letters. She called him the kindest man she knew. Even after the war, when the world learned the full scale of what her father had done, Gudrun refused to believe it. She said the stories were lies, that the camps were fake, that her father had only ever wanted peace. While other children of Nazis questioned everything, Gudrun doubled down. She didn't run from her father's past. She defended it. And she didn't just talk, she took action. In the years after the war, Gudrun helped form and lead a secretive group called Stille Hilfe, Silent Help. It was created to support former SS officers, Nazi war criminals, and their families. They gave money, legal help, and safe houses to some of the worst people in history. Gudrun was deeply involved. She helped organize protests against war crime trials. She visited imprisoned SS men and called them heroes. She claimed her father was wrongly accused, that the Holocaust was an invention, that the Nazis were misunderstood. To her, the fall of the Third Reich was not justice. It was betrayal. Gudrun never gave interviews. She stayed in the shadows, rarely seen in public. But those who followed her work said she was calm, polite, and utterly committed to the cause. She didn't shout like Niklas Frank. She didn't cry like Monika Hertwig. She believed, and that belief was frightening, because it showed how deep indoctrination can go, how a child raised in lies can grow into an adult who defends them. Gudrun wasn't stupid. She had access to the facts. But to her, truth didn't matter. Loyalty did. Even into her old age, Gudrun fought to keep her father's name clean. She was seen at SS veterans' funerals, sitting quietly in the back, surrounded by old men in dark suits who still believed in the Reich. She never married. She never had children. Some say her life was one long mission, to protect the man who built Auschwitz. But why? Why would someone cling so tightly to something so evil? Maybe because letting go would mean destroying her entire world. Everything she believed in, every childhood memory, every smile in those old photographs. To face the truth would mean admitting that the man who kissed her goodnight was also the man who ordered millions to die. And she couldn't do it, so she chose loyalty. Gudrun Himmler died in 2018, still defending her father's memory, still helping former Nazis, still refusing to say the words so many others had managed to say. He was guilty. Her story is disturbing, not because she was violent, but because she wasn't. She was polite, educated, well-spoken, and still, she held on to the ideology like it was a family heirloom. She shows us that hate doesn't always look like rage. Sometimes it looks like love. But while Gudrun stayed loyal to the man who created Auschwitz, another heir was born inside it. And he would spend his life trying to erase his own name. Rainer Höss, erasing the bloodline. Rainer Höss is the grandson of Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz, the most infamous death camp of the Holocaust. His grandfather oversaw the murder of over 1 million people. The gas chambers, the mass graves, the ashes in the air, all of it happened under his watch. And Rainer was born into that legacy. He grew up in a family that never talked about it. The name Auschwitz was a whisper, a shadow. No one explained. No one admitted. The past sat in the corner like a sleeping beast, and everyone acted like it wasn't there. But Rainer felt it. Even as a child, something was off. Then, as a teenager, he started asking questions. And once he learned the truth, the full truth about what his grandfather had done, he was horrified. Rainer didn't try to defend it. He didn't pretend it was propaganda. He didn't look away. He stood up. and he cut ties with his family. He tore down every photograph of his grandfather. He refused to speak to relatives who still made excuses or denied the Holocaust ever happened. When one of them called his grandfather a man of honor, Rainer walked out of the room and never came back. And then, he went to Auschwitz. Not as a visitor, as a witness. He stood in front of the old commandant's house, the same house his father had grown up in, just meters away from the gas chambers. The same place where children once played on the lawn while people screamed behind barbed wire. He stood there and said, "My grandfather lived here. Thousands died because of him." It wasn't for show, it was for truth and for the dead. Since then, Rainer has made it his mission to speak to young people, especially in Germany, where the wounds of the past still live under the surface. He goes to schools and talks to students about his family. He shows them where hatred leads. He warns them what silence can cost. But not everyone wants him to speak. Rainer has received death threats from neo-Nazis, who see him as a traitor to his blood. Even worse, some of the threats came from his own relatives. They say he's shaming the family. They say he's turned against his grandfather. And Rainer answers, "Yes, I have, and I'm proud of it." He's not just a speaker, he's an activist. He works with Holocaust memorial groups. He shares survivor testimonies. He reminds people that remembering isn't just about the past, it's about preventing the future. And yet, the weight never goes away. In interviews, Rainer has said that he sometimes feels guilt, not because he did anything wrong, but because he carries the name of someone who did. He's even considered changing it completely, but in the end, he keeps it as a weapon, as a warning, a way to show that the worst legacy can be broken. He once said, "My name is a burden, but I use it to make sure people never forget." Rainer Höss could have stayed silent. He could have disappeared. He could have hidden behind wealth or lies or the comfort of family. But he chose the hard road. He chose truth. And in doing so, he became something rare, a bridge between the past and the present. But not every heir chose the spotlight. Some disappeared into quiet lives, hiding their names, their pasts, and the bloodlines they were born into. They didn't deny it. They didn't embrace it. They just vanished, hoping history wouldn't find them. Bettina Göring, the end of the line. Bettina Göring didn't want to disappear. She wanted to end. She's the great-niece of Hermann Göring, one of the most powerful men in Nazi Germany. He was Hitler's right hand, head of the Luftwaffe, and founder of the Gestapo. At the Nuremberg trials, he was sentenced to death, but swallowed cyanide before they could hang him. Bettina never knew him. She was born after the war, into a family haunted by his ghost. His portrait hung on the wall of her grandmother's house, eyes cold and blue, staring down like a god. She grew up feeling it, the name, the weight, the stares. Even in school, she felt different, tainted. As she got older, she learned more about who Göring was, how he helped orchestrate mass murder, stole art from Jewish families, and lived in obscene luxury while others starved and died. And Bettina couldn't bear it. She didn't want to carry on that name. She didn't want to pass it on. So she and her brother made a choice. They both got sterilized. "I didn't want to bring another Göring into this world," she once said. It wasn't a political statement. It was personal. She wasn't angry. She wasn't proud. She was just trying to stop the line, to cut off the branch before it could grow again. It was guilt, yeah, but not the loud kind. Not the kind that shouts in classrooms or debates history on stages. It was quiet, deep in the bones. She moved far away, from Germany, from her family, from the ghosts. She settled in a small town in New Mexico, surrounded by desert and silence. There, she lives a simple life with her husband, painting and gardening. She tries not to think about the past, but it's always there. In one interview, she said, "It's like I carry a shadow in my DNA." She's not ashamed of who she is, but she's haunted by who he was, and the idea that somehow it might live on through her. That maybe hatred isn't just taught, maybe it lingers, passed down like a terrible inheritance. So she ended it. No children, no legacy, no more Görings. She and her brother made sure the bloodline stops with them. Some heirs gave up their name, but others wore it like armor. They rewrote the past, defended it. And one man spent decades trying to clear his father's name, even as history kept dragging it back into the light. Wolf Rüdiger Hess, the son who believed the lie. His father was Rudolf Hess, Hitler's closest friend, deputy, and one of the most fanatical Nazis in the early years of the regime. Hess had marched in Hitler's failed 1923 coup, served prison time with him, and helped write Mein Kampf. But in 1941, Hess did something strange. He got in a plane, flew to Britain alone, and parachuted into Scotland, claiming he wanted to broker peace between Nazi Germany and the British Empire. Britain didn't buy it. Neither did Hitler. Hess was arrested, declared mentally unstable, and spent the rest of the war in British custody. After the war, he was tried at Nuremberg, convicted of crimes against peace, and sentenced to life in prison. He died in Spandau prison in 1987, at 93 years old, the last Nazi still behind bars. To the world, Rudolf Hess was a war criminal. To his son, he was a martyr. Wolf Rüdiger Hess was just a boy when his father made that doomed flight to Britain. He barely saw him again. For most of his life, his father was a voice in letters and a face behind prison glass. But that distance didn't create doubt. It created obsession. Wolf Rüdiger dedicated his adult life to clearing his father's name. He insisted that Rudolf Hess had been a peace envoy, sent by Hitler to negotiate an end to the war, that the British had covered it up, that Hess was a political prisoner, not a criminal. And when his father died, officially by suicide, Wolf Rüdiger declared it murder. He claimed British intelligence agents had killed him to keep secrets buried. He published books with titles like Who Murdered My Father, Rudolf Hess, and gave interviews filled with conspiracy theories. To him, the facts didn't matter. The war crimes didn't matter. The Holocaust? He barely mentioned it. Everything revolved around his father's image. His mission was simple: preserve the Hess name. But preserving it meant rewriting it. And so Wolf Rüdiger became part of something dangerous. A second wave, because the first wave of damage, the war, the death camps, the genocide, that came from the Nazis themselves. But the second wave came later, from those who tried to rewrite what had happened. People like Wolf Rüdiger didn't storm any cities. They didn't give orders to kill. But they softened the truth. They made excuses. They cherry-picked history. They raised doubt, even when the evidence was overwhelming. And in doing so, they gave space to something poisonous, to Holocaust denial, to Nazi sympathizers, to the idea that maybe the past wasn't so bad. Wolf Rüdiger didn't march with neo-Nazis. He wasn't violent. But his books became popular in far-right circles. His conspiracy theories spread. His belief that his father was a hero gave cover to people who wanted the Third Reich back. When Spandau prison was finally demolished after Hess's death, Wolf Rüdiger was furious. He called it a crime against history. He wanted the cell preserved, like a shrine, like a monument. He kept pictures of his father on his wall. He gave tours. He signed autographs. For him, memory wasn't a burden. It was a battle. And he was still fighting it. The contrast between him and people like Niklas Frank or Rüdiger Hess couldn't be more extreme. Where they chose truth, he chose denial. Where they sought to break the cycle, he tried to continue it. And here's what makes his story even more haunting. He truly believed he was doing the right thing. In interviews, he sounded calm, intelligent, polite. Not a ranting extremist, not a villain. But that's the danger. That's how revisionism works. It doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers. It looks respectable. It comes dressed in suits and books and courtroom language. But underneath, it's still rot. Wolf Rüdiger Hess died in 2001, still defending his father, still writing letters, still blaming the world. He didn't carry guilt. He carried pride. And that's a reminder. The past isn't always dead. Sometimes it passes itself off as truth. But guilt doesn't always come in headlines. It doesn't always scream in school lectures or spill out in courtroom debates. Sometimes it hides. In money, in silence, in companies that once fed the Nazi war machine and survived to become global brands. And that brings us to a different kind of heir. Not one born with a name like Himmler or Goethe, but one born into wealth built on horror, Harald Quandt, the Nazi stepson who built an empire. While some heirs carried guilt like a wound, and others wore denial like armor, Harald Quandt carried a bank account. His story doesn't start in the ruins of a prison cell or on the steps of a school, shouting about justice. It starts in luxury and silence. Harald was the only surviving child of Magda Goebbels, wife of Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister. Magda and Joseph were inseparable from the regime. They stood at Hitler's side to the very end. But when Berlin fell and the Red Army surrounded the bunker, the Goebbels made a final, horrific choice. They poisoned their 6 children, then committed suicide. They couldn't imagine a world without the Third Reich. Except one child survived. Harald. He wasn't in the bunker that day. He was a soldier, captured by Allied forces and sitting in a POW camp. By the time he got out, his entire family was gone. But he wasn't alone. You see, Magda had been married once before. Harald was her son from that earlier marriage, to a wealthy industrialist named Gudrun Quandt. And Gudrun Quandt had been one of Germany's richest men. His factories made guns, ammunition, and batteries for Hitler's war machine. And those factories used forced labor. Tens of thousands of prisoners and concentration camp inmates worked to death in silence. After the war, Gudrun Quandt somehow avoided serious punishment. He kept his empire. And when he died, Harald inherited it. In the decades that followed, Harald Quandt became one of the richest men in West Germany. He helped build up the family fortune, investing in companies, expanding the empire, and helping to shape what would become the modern BMW dynasty. Today, the Quandt family controls a massive share of BMW. They are worth billions. For decades, nobody asked where that wealth came from. Nobody wanted to talk about the prisoners, the deaths, the Nazi connections. The Quandts stayed silent. The public looked away. It wasn't until 2007, more than 60 years after the war, that something finally cracked open. A German documentary aired on national television. It was called The Silence of the Quandts. It pulled back the curtain on the family's Nazi past, the forced labor, the profits from war, the deaths in the factories. It was the first time many Germans realized that the wealth behind one of their most iconic brands had been soaked in blood. The public was outraged, and for the first time the Quandts were forced to respond. They announced an internal investigation, a historical review of the family's Nazi ties. But they were clear. There would be no compensation for survivors. No apology. just information. The review confirmed what the documentary said. Tens of thousands of forced laborers had worked and died in Quandt-owned factories. The family had benefited directly from the war, and after 1945, they had never been held accountable. Harald Quandt died in 1967, long before any of this came to light. He never faced questions, never made statements, never spoke publicly about his family's role in the Nazi era. And maybe that's the point, because his story isn't about rage like Niklas Frank's. It's not about shame like Bettina Göring's, or denial like Rüdiger Hess. It's about something quieter, but just as dangerous: power. The kind of power that buys silence, that turns war crimes into inheritance, that lets one family move from the heart of the Third Reich into the boardrooms of global capitalism without ever looking back. For most people, the name Goebbels is a curse. But for Harald, the name Quandt opened doors. It insulated him from judgment, from investigation, from the truth. Even today, the Quandt family is careful. They rarely give interviews. They keep a low profile. They've given money to museums and educational programs, but still refuse to formally acknowledge or atone for their Nazi connections. To some, that's cowardice. To others, it's just strategy. Martin Bormann Jr. and Manfred Rommel, the peacemakers. Not every heir carried hate, silence, or guilt. Some chose something else entirely. They chose peace. Martin Bormann Jr. was born into a name stained with blood. His father, Martin Bormann Sr., was Hitler's private secretary, one of the inner circle. A true believer in Nazi ideology. Cold, ruthless, powerful. When the Third Reich collapsed, Bormann Sr. vanished. For years, no one knew what happened to him. Some believed he fled to South America. Others said he was still pulling strings in secret. In reality, his body lay buried near Berlin, unidentified until the 1970s. Martin Jr. was just a teenager when his father disappeared. He grew up in a Catholic boarding school, surrounded by whispers and suspicion. But instead of falling into denial or anger, he found something unexpected: faith. He became a Catholic priest. He traveled, he preached, and he spoke out about guilt, memory, and the burden of his name. He met with Holocaust survivors, asked for forgiveness. He didn't defend his father. He didn't try to rewrite history. He tried to build bridges, even when it cost him. At one point, the church suspended him for controversial comments about understanding Nazi youth. But he kept going, kept speaking, kept reaching out. He once said, "I stand for a different Germany, one that remembers." He wasn't trying to erase the past. He was trying to heal it. Manfred Rommel had a very different story, but a similar heart. His father was Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, one of Nazi Germany's most famous generals. Unlike others, Rommel wasn't part of the inner Nazi circle. He wasn't involved in the Holocaust. In fact, near the end of the war, he was linked to the plot to kill Hitler. For that, Hitler forced him to commit suicide. Manfred was just 15. After the war, he didn't run from his father's name, but he didn't worship it either. He became a lawyer, then a politician, eventually mayor of Stuttgart, one of Germany's largest cities. And as mayor, he did something rare. He built friendships with Holocaust survivors. He invited Jews and immigrants to his city. He stood up for liberal causes, often against the far right. He even became close friends with the sons of Allied generals, including U.S. General Patton. To many, Manfred Rommel represented a new kind of Germany, proud of its democracy, open to the world, unafraid to face its past. He didn't choose silence or shame. He chose responsibility. Not all the children of the Third Reich were guilty, but each of them was handed a name that came with shadows and scars. Some denied it, some were crushed by it, and a few, bravely, tried to confront it. They were born into a legacy written in ash and blood, a history they didn't choose, but couldn't escape. Their lives force us to ask, if your name came from horror, what would you do with it?